December 8, 1941, 8 hours after Pearl Harbor. Commander Tyrrell Jacobs stood on the bridge of USS Sargo as his submarine slipped beneath the waters off Manila Bay. His orders were clear: proceed to Japanese home waters and begin unrestricted submarine warfare against the Imperial Japanese Navy and Merchant Marine. What neither Jacobs nor anyone in the American submarine force understood was that they were about to fight a war with weapons that didn't work, in boats that weren't quite ready, against an enemy who had fundamentally miscalculated what American industrial capacity could produce when properly motivated. The Japanese Naval General Staff had prepared meticulously for war with the United States. Their intelligence assessments, compiled over years of observation and analysis, concluded that America might possess perhaps 30 operational fleet submarines at the war's outbreak, with production capacity to build maybe another 30 or 40 over the 40 following year. These numbers seemed reasonable, even generous. Submarine construction was complex, time-consuming, and expensive. The boats required sophisticated diesel engines, intricate electrical systems, pressure hulls manufactured to exacting tolerances, and crews trained for months in operations that killed men who made mistakes. What Japanese planners failed to understand was that American industrial capacity, once fully mobilized for total war, operated on a scale that rendered pre-war assumptions meaningless. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards would launch 240 Gato-class fleet submarines, an additional 42 of the improved Balao-class, and 35 of the even more advanced Tench-class. 317 fleet submarines in less than 4 years, produced by shipyards that had built exactly 0 submarines in 1939. The mathematics of this production achievement stagger comprehension even 8 decades later. Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut, which had built submarines since 1900, launched its first Gato-class boat, USS Drum, in May 1941. By December 1941, Electric Boat had 4 Gatos under construction simultaneously. By mid-1943, the yard was launching 1 complete fleet submarine every 2 weeks. Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in Kittery, Maine, which had never built a fleet submarine before 1940, produced 46 Gato and Balao-class boats between 1941 and 1945. But the real revolution came from Mare Island Naval Shipyard in Vallejo, California, and Manitowoc Shipbuilding Company in Manitowoc, Wisconsin. Mare Island, which had built cruisers and destroyers but no submarines before 1939, retooled completely and launched 17 Gato-class boats. Manitowoc, located on Lake Michigan, over 1,000 miles from the nearest ocean, built 28 fleet submarines that had to be floated down the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico before they could reach the Pacific. The boats were too large for the river's locks, so Manitowoc built them with temporary bow sections that could be removed, floated the submarines through the locks, then reinstalled the bow sections at New Orleans. This wasn't elegant engineering, it was brute force, problem-solving, driven by the recognition that American survival required more submarines than anyone thought possible to build. Japanese intelligence officers monitoring American shipyard activity through 1942 compiled reports noting increased submarine construction but consistently underestimated the actual numbers. Partly this resulted from deliberate American deception, announcing submarines by name but obscuring which were new construction versus older S-class boats being refitted. Partly it came from Japanese assumptions that submarine production couldn't exceed certain rates based on their own construction experience. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Imperial Japanese Navy's own submarine program provided the mental framework for their intelligence assessments. Japanese yards built approximately 130 submarines during the war. Remarkable production for a nation with limited industrial capacity and resources. But Japanese submarine construction emphasized large, sophisticated boats designed for fleet operations and long-range reconnaissance. The Type A submarines displaced over 3,000 tons, surfaced, carried aircraft in waterproof hangars, and required 30 months to build. Japanese planners assumed American submarines, if they matched Japanese capabilities, would require similar construction times and resources. The Gato-class represented fundamentally different design philosophy. At 1,525 tons surface displacement, Gatos were smaller than Japanese fleet submarines. They carried no aircraft, mounted fewer torpedo tubes than some Japanese designs, and sacrificed some capabilities that Japanese designers considered essential. What the Gato-class possessed was reliability, range, habitability sufficient for 2-month patrols, and above all, manufacturability. Every component was designed for mass production using standardized parts. The pressure hull used rolled steel plate that any heavy industrial yard could work. The diesel engines were marinized versions of locomotive engines already in mass production. The electrical systems used components common to American industrial equipment. Most critically, the Gato design could be built in sections by yards with no submarine experience. Electric Boat Company provided detailed construction plans to Portsmouth, Mare Island, and Manitowoc. Each yard built their first Gato slowly, learning the specialized techniques required for pressure hull welding and precise alignment of hull sections. But by their third or fourth boat, construction times dropped dramatically as workers developed expertise and yard managers optimized production workflows. Commander Jacobs, stalking Japanese merchant ships off Indochina in December 1941 aboard Sargo, had no knowledge that his submarine represented the prototype for what would become the most successful submarine class in naval history. He was entirely focused on a more immediate problem. His torpedoes didn't work. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, Sargo encountered 4 Japanese cargo ships steaming in loose convoy without escort. Jacobs maneuvered into ideal attack position and fired 12 torpedoes from ranges between 1,000 and 2,000 yards. Perfect conditions, calm seas, excellent visibility, targets making steady courses. Not a single explosion. Every torpedo either missed entirely, malfunctioned, or struck the target and failed to detonate. Jacobs returned to Manila Bay on December 30th, having expended all 24 torpedoes aboard without sinking a single ship. His after-action report stated unequivocally that the torpedoes were running far deeper than their set depths, passing harmlessly beneath targets. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington dismissed his complaints with barely concealed contempt. The problem, Bureau officers insisted, lay with submarine commanders who didn't understand proper torpedo maintenance, not with the torpedoes themselves. This pattern repeated itself with numbing regularity across the Pacific through 1942. American submarines stalked targets, maneuvered into perfect attack positions, fired torpedoes that should have guaranteed kills, and achieved nothing. The statistics documented the disaster. In 1942, American submarines fired 1,442 torpedoes at Japanese targets. Post-war analysis of Japanese records revealed they actually sank 109 ships, totaling 418,000 tons, barely 3% of claimed tonnage. Japanese merchant captains began reporting American torpedoes lodged unexploded in their hulls while their ships limped safely into port for repairs. Japanese intelligence officers compiled detailed reports on American torpedo failures. These reports reached Imperial Naval General Headquarters in Tokyo by early 1942 and were analyzed by intelligence staff who drew precisely wrong conclusions. American torpedoes, they reported, were primitive weapons plagued by fundamental design flaws. American submariners were poorly trained and lacked aggressive spirit. The vaunted American industrial capacity was producing weapons that didn't work. This assessment, based on accurate observation of American failures, but fundamentally wrong in its interpretation, would prove catastrophic throughout 1942 and into early 1943, as American submarine crews filed increasingly furious reports about defective torpedoes. Japanese convoy protection doctrine remained focused primarily on protecting naval task forces rather than merchant shipping. Resources that might have gone to building escort vessels, developing effective sonar and radar, training anti-submarine warfare crews, instead went to battleships and fleet carriers. The assumption that American submarines posed manageable threat shaped resource allocation decisions that would prove fatal. The truth was more complex and ultimately more ominous than Japanese assessments suggested. The Mark 14 torpedo suffered from 3 catastrophic defects that masked each other and made diagnosis extraordinarily difficult. First, the torpedo ran 10 to 11 feet deeper than its set depth because engineers had never properly tested the depth control mechanism with the heavier combat warhead. Second, the Mark 6 magnetic exploder proved wildly unreliable, detonating prematurely or failing to detonate at all, depending on local magnetic field variations. Third, the contact exploder used a firing pin design that bound and jammed at high impact velocities, particularly on direct 90-degree hits that submarine commanders were trained to shoot. The breaking point came in July 1943. Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Daspit, commanding USS Tynosa on her second war patrol, spotted the 19,000-ton whale factory ship Tonan Maru No. 3 alone and unescorted south of Truk. Daspit fired 15 torpedoes at the perfect target under ideal conditions. 6 hit and failed to explode. 9 hit and failed to explode. Daspit kept his last torpedo unfired for analysis and cleared the area. He had executed 15 perfect shots, 15 duds. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, Commander Submarines Pacific Fleet, recognized Daspit's experience represented a controlled experiment conducted under combat conditions. Lockwood ordered immediate testing. His staff constructed testing ranges where dummy warheads were dropped from pier cranes onto steel plates at various angles. The tests revealed the firing pin mechanism bound and jammed at high impact velocities, particularly at 90-degree impact angles. Direct hits, supposedly perfect shots, generated such sudden deceleration that the firing pin couldn't move fast enough to strike the detonator cap. The solution came from examining wreckage of Japanese aircraft shot down at Pearl Harbor. Engineers discovered Japanese propeller blades were made from lightweight aluminum alloy rather than steel. If the firing pin were made from lightweight aluminum instead of steel, it would have less inertia during deceleration and would be less likely to bind. Tests confirmed the theory. By September 1943, 21 months after Pearl Harbor, modified torpedoes with aluminum firing pins began reaching submarines at Pearl Harbor, Fremantle. The transformation in American submarine effectiveness after September 1943 represented one of the most dramatic capability shifts in naval warfare history. Submarine commanders who had survived 2 years of combat despite defective weapons now possessed torpedoes that actually worked. The effect on Japanese shipping was immediate and catastrophic. But the torpedo fix alone doesn't explain what happened next. The real revolution came from the intersection of 3 factors that Japanese intelligence failed to anticipate: functional torpedoes, industrial production of submarines on unprecedented scale, and American cryptanalysis that provided submarine commanders with targeting information Japanese thought impossible. Commander Richard O'Kane took command of USS Tang in October 1943, just as the corrected torpedoes began reaching the fleet. O'Kane had served as executive officer aboard USS Wahoo under Commander Dudley Morton, learning aggressive tactics that pushed submarines to their operational limits. Morton had sunk 19 ships before Wahoo was lost with all hands in October 1943. O'Kane inherited Morton's tactical philosophy and combined it with torpedoes that finally worked. Tang's first war patrol in January 1944 demonstrated what American submarines could accomplish once their primary weapon functioned properly. Operating in the East China Sea, O'Kane intercepted a convoy of 5 tankers carrying crude oil from the Dutch East Indies to Japan. He maneuvered Tang into attack position on the night of January 23rd and fired 6 torpedoes in rapid succession. All 6 functioned perfectly. 3 tankers, the 10,000-ton Gyoten Maru, Oi Maru, and Yamashimo Maru, went to the bottom in less than 20 minutes. In a single attack, O'Kane had sunk over 30,000 tons of shipping and sent hundreds of thousands of gallons of irreplaceable crude oil to the ocean floor. This wasn't luck or exceptional skill. though O'Kane possessed both. This was precisely executed attack using weapons that now worked as designed. Tang completed 5 war patrols between January and October 1944, sinking 24 ships, totaling 93,000 tons. O'Kane received the Medal of Honor and became the most successful American submarine commander of the war by confirmed tonnage. His success wasn't unique. It represented what happened when functional torpedoes met aggressive commanders and excellent targeting intelligence. The cryptanalysis breakthrough came from Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor and Station Cast in Melbourne. American cryptanalysts had partially broken Japanese naval codes before Pearl Harbor, but the breakthrough came in mid-1942 with systematic reading of the Japanese Merchant Marine Code. By early 1943, American intelligence could read approximately 60% of Japanese convoy routing messages. By late 1943, that figure exceeded 80%. Japanese merchant convoys radioed their routes, speeds, and destinations using what they believed were secure codes. Station Hypo intercepted these transmissions, decoded them, and forwarded the intelligence to submarine commands at Pearl Harbor and Fremantle. Submarine commanders received what they called ultra-intelligence, summaries that provided convoy routes, composition, speeds, and schedules, without revealing how the information was obtained. A typical ultra message might read, 6 merchant ships escorted by 2 destroyers, bearing 270 degrees, speed 10 knots, expected at grid coordinates specified at 0613th. Armed with this intelligence, submarine commanders could position their boats along convoy routes and intercept targets with near certainty. The submarines didn't hunt blindly across vast ocean expanses. They went exactly where Japanese ships would be, waited, and attacked. Japanese convoy commanders couldn't understand how American submarines repeatedly appeared in their path. They assumed betrayal by spies, leaks from shore-based personnel, or impossibly good reconnaissance. They never suspected their own codes were compromised because Japanese cryptographic security doctrine insisted their naval codes were unbreakable. The combination of functional torpedoes, accurate targeting intelligence, and rapidly increasing numbers of submarines created catastrophic losses for Japanese merchant shipping. In January 1944, American submarines sank approximately 200,000 tons of Japanese shipping. In February, 180,000 tons. In March, 200,000 tons. In April, over 300,000 tons. Each month, submarines were sinking more tonnage than Japanese shipyards could build in 3 months. The Gato-class boats that enabled this destruction were arriving in the Pacific at rates Japanese intelligence consistently underestimated. Electric Boat Company alone launched 13 Gato-class submarines in 1943. Portsmouth Naval Shipyard launched 9. Mare Island launched 7. Manitowoc launched 8. 37 fleet submarines entered service in a single year from just 4 yards. Japanese intelligence estimates suggested American submarine strength might be growing by 15 to 20 boats per year. The actual figure was nearly double that, and accelerating. By January 1944, the Pacific Submarine Force operated 78 fleet submarines simultaneously, a number that exceeded Japan's entire submarine force. By June 1944, that figure reached 95 boats. By December 1944, 117. Japanese anti-submarine forces faced not 30 or 40 American submarines as pre-war estimates suggested, but over 100 boats operating simultaneously across the Pacific, each capable of 2-month patrols at ranges exceeding 10,000 nautical miles. The Gato-class design's range and endurance proved critical to the campaign's success. Japanese shipping routes stretched from Singapore to Yokohama, from the oil fields of Borneo to the refineries on Honshu, from the iron mines of Manchuria to the steel mills of Osaka. Protecting these routes required convoy escorts, patrol craft, and anti-submarine forces spread across millions of square miles of ocean. Japanese naval construction priorities, shaped by pre-war doctrine emphasizing decisive fleet action, produced battleships and fleet carriers rather than destroyer escorts and patrol craft suitable for convoy protection. When the war began, the Imperial Japanese Navy operated approximately 400 destroyer-type vessels, but most were fleet destroyers designed for high-speed surface action, not convoy escort. Only about 60 ships were suitable for anti-submarine warfare, equipped with effective sonar, adequate depth charges. This force had to protect naval task forces, troop convoys, and merchant shipping across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The mathematics were impossible. 600 Japanese merchant ships at sea at any given time, protected by 60 capable anti-submarine vessels, meant most convoys sailed with inadequate escort or none at all. American submarine commanders exploited this weakness systematically. Commander Sam Dealey, commanding USS Harder, developed tactics specifically designed to eliminate Japanese escort vessels before attacking convoys. On June 15, 1944, operating off Tawi-Tawi, Dealey intercepted a convoy protected by destroyers. Rather than avoiding the escorts to attack merchant ships, Dealey deliberately targeted the destroyers. In 5 days, Harder sank 5 Japanese destroyers, Minatsuki, Hayamami, Tanikaze, and damaged 2 others. Dealey's after-action report stated bluntly that killing escorts improved hunting conditions for all American submarines in the area. His assessment proved accurate. Japanese escort commanders, already stretched thin protecting hundreds of convoys with inadequate forces, grew increasingly cautious after losing multiple destroyers to submarine attack. Escorts that might have aggressively hunted submarines instead focused on defensive formations around convoy charges, reducing their effectiveness. This caution created gaps that American submarines exploited ruthlessly. The Pacific submarine campaign's success ultimately rested on simple mathematics that Japanese planners failed to account for in their pre-war assessments. American industrial capacity could build submarines faster than Japan could sink them, and sink ships faster than Japan could build them. By 1944, American shipyards were launching fleet submarines at a rate of approximately 1 every 9 days. Japanese anti-submarine forces were sinking American submarines at a rate of approximately 1 every 45 days. The exchange rate was unsustainable for Japan. Japanese merchant losses mounted catastrophically through 1944. In July, submarines sank over 400,000 tons of shipping. In August, 350,000 tons. In September, 400,000 tons. In October, 450,000 tons, the highest monthly total of the war. These weren't just numbers in intelligence reports. Each sinking represented crude oil that wouldn't reach Japanese refineries, iron ore that wouldn't reach steel mills, food that wouldn't reach cities, troops that wouldn't reach garrisons, ammunition that wouldn't reach frontline units. The economic consequences rippled through every aspect of Japan's war effort. Oil refineries on the home islands shut down for lack of crude from the Dutch East Indies. Steel mills closed for lack of iron ore and coking coal. Aircraft factories stopped producing for lack of aluminum. Training programs for pilots and sailors ground to a halt for lack of fuel. Naval vessels sat pierside for lack of oil. The combined fleet, once the 3rd largest navy in the world, was reduced to immobility by lack of fuel for its ships. The home islands faced potential starvation as food imports ceased. Japan had never been self-sufficient in food production, relying on imports from Korea, Formosa, and Southeast Asia. By 1945, those imports had been reduced to a trickle by submarine attacks on cargo ships. Urban populations in Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya faced increasing hunger as rice rations were cut repeatedly. Commander Eugene Flocke understood that sinking ships was only half the equation. The other half was understanding which ships mattered most to Japan's war economy. When Flocke took command of USS Barb in April 1944, he brought with him a background in engineering and a recognition that the submarine campaign was ultimately economic warfare. Tonnage sunk mattered, but the cargo in those holds mattered more. Japanese logistics by mid-1944 operated on razor-thin margins. The loss of a single tanker carrying crude oil from Borneo might shut down refineries for weeks. The loss of a cargo ship carrying manganese ore might halt steel production at multiple mills. The loss of a transport carrying replacement aircraft engines might ground entire air groups. Fluckey studied intelligence reports on Japanese cargo movements, identifying high-value targets whose destruction would cascade through Japan's war economy. Barb's 8th War Patrol in December 1944 demonstrated this approach. Operating in the East China Sea, Fluckey intercepted intelligence about a convoy carrying munitions from Shanghai to Japan. Rather than attacking the largest ships for maximum tonnage, Fluckey prioritized the ammunition ships. On the night of December 31, 1944, Barb penetrated the convoy's escort screen and fired 6 torpedoes at 2 cargo ships identified as munitions carriers. Both ships exploded with such violence that Fluckey initially thought his torpedoes had malfunctioned prematurely. The secondary explosions from detonating cargo obliterated both ships within seconds, the blast waves damaging nearby escort vessels. Post-war Japanese records revealed those 2 ships carried over 1,500 tons of artillery ammunition, replacement aircraft engines, and radio equipment destined for Japanese forces in the Philippines. The loss forced postponement of planned counterattacks because units lacked the ammunition to sustain offensive operations. One submarine attack on 2 relatively small cargo ships had operational consequences far exceeding the raw tonnage sunk. Barb's 11th War Patrol in June 1945 achieved even more spectacular results. Operating off the Kuriles, Fluckey encountered minimal anti-submarine activity because Japanese anti-submarine forces had been concentrated in more southern waters, where American submarine activity was historically heavier. Over 26 days, Barb sank 17 ships, totaling 96,000 tons, setting a record for tonnage sunk on a single patrol that would never be exceeded. On June 23, operating in Namquan Harbour, Fluckey executed an attack on an anchored convoy. In 54 minutes of furious action, Barb sank 4 ships totaling over 15,000 tons. These weren't random successes. These were systematically executed attacks exploiting intelligence about convoy routes and Japanese anti-submarine weaknesses, delivered by a submarine commander who had learned through 3 years of experience exactly how to employ his weapons to maximum effect. Fluckey received the Medal of Honor for Barb's 11th Patrol. More significantly, his tactics became case studies taught at submarine school, demonstrating how aggressive commanders with functional weapons and good intelligence could devastate enemy shipping. The Japanese response to mounting submarine losses came too late and with insufficient resources. By mid-1944, Imperial Naval Headquarters finally recognized that American submarines posed an existential threat to Japan's ability to continue the war. Emergency programs initiated to increase convoy escorts and anti-submarine capabilities confronted reality that Japanese shipyards were already working at maximum capacity building replacement merchant ships, repair naval vessels damaged in combat, and completing naval construction programs initiated years earlier. The Grand Escort Command Fleet, established in November 1943, consolidated all Japanese anti-submarine forces under unified command and attempted to implement convoy protection doctrine modeled on Allied systems. But the command faced impossible mathematics. Over 800 Japanese merchant ships remained operational in mid-1944, requiring protection, across shipping routes stretching from Singapore to the home islands. The Grand Escort Command Fleet could field approximately 80 destroyer escorts and patrol vessels capable of effective anti-submarine warfare. This meant most convoys sailed with a single escort or none at all. Moreover, Japanese anti-submarine technology lagged American capabilities significantly. Japanese sonar, developed in the 1930s with limited resources, couldn't match American or British systems. Detection ranges rarely exceeded 2,000 yards under ideal conditions, often much less in typical ocean conditions. American submarines, operating at periscope depth 2,000 yards from a convoy, could attack before Japanese sonar detected them. Japanese depth charges, while effective if they detonated close enough to a submarine, used obsolete fusing mechanisms that detonated at preset depths. American submarines learned to dive below the typical depth charge setting, usually 300, feet and escape, while Japanese escorts dropped charges that exploded harmlessly above them. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese escort commanders filed increasingly desperate reports through 1944 and into 1945, documenting their inability to protect convoys adequately. A typical after-action report from March 1945 described a convoy of 6 merchant ships with 2 destroyer escorts traveling from Singapore to Yokohama. American submarines attacked 5 times over 8 days. The escorts detected the submarines on 3 occasions and conducted depth charge attacks without apparent success. The convoy lost 4 of 6 merchant ships. The escorts survived but prevented none of the attacks from succeeding. These reports accumulated into a comprehensive picture of systemic failure. Japanese anti-submarine doctrine, equipment, and training could not counter American submarines operating with good intelligence and functional weapons. Japanese naval construction capacity could not replace ships faster than submarines were sinking them. Japanese merchant marine personnel losses were reaching catastrophic levels as experienced officers and sailors died when their ships were torpedoed, and replacements lacked the training and experience to operate safely in contested waters. The human cost for Japanese merchant sailors remains difficult to quantify precisely, but was certainly devastating. These men, civilians serving aboard merchant vessels, died by the thousands as submarines torpedoed their ships. They drowned in oil-filled waters, burned alive when tankers exploded, died of exposure in lifeboats that drifted for weeks without rescue. The Imperial Japanese Navy maintained no effective rescue service for merchant sailors, viewing them as expendable civilian personnel rather than critical national resources whose survival should be prioritized. Captain Hideo Tachibana, commander of the tanker Kyokuyo Maru, survived 3 submarine attacks between January and August 1944. His ship was torpedoed and damaged on January 12, but made port. Repairs took 6 weeks. His next voyage ended on March 23, when a submarine attack killed 12 crew members, but left the ship still seaworthy. After another round of repairs, Kyokuyo Maru sailed again in July. On August 16, USS Rasher fired 4 torpedoes. All 4 hit. Kyokuyo Maru broke in half and sank in under 4 minutes. Tachibana and 8 crew members survived out of 62 aboard. His testimony after the war described the psychological toll of sailing repeatedly into waters where submarines waited, knowing that each voyage might be the last, that survival depended entirely on luck. By early 1945, Japanese merchant sailors refused to sail on certain routes where submarine activity was heaviest. Ships destined for the oil fields of Borneo or the rice paddies of Indochina often sat in port for weeks, waiting for crews willing to make the voyage. Japanese authorities implemented increasingly coercive measures, drafting merchant sailors into naval service to impose military discipline and prevent desertion. These measures proved counterproductive, further damaging morale and reducing the effectiveness of crews forced to sail against their judgment. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 demonstrated how completely submarines had shifted the strategic balance. As Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force approached the Philippines through Palawan Passage on October 23, 2 American submarines waited in ambush. USS Data, commanded by Commander David McClintock, and USS Dace, commanded by Commander Bladen Claggett, had been positioned along the expected transit route based on excellent intelligence from code-breaking operations. At 05:32 hours, Data detected the Japanese column on radar at 30,000 yards. McClintock tracked the force for 4 hours, while radioing contact reports that allowed Dace to position for a coordinated attack. At 09:27 hours, Data fired 6 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Otago, Admiral Kurita's flagship. 4 torpedoes hit, the explosions tearing huge holes in Otago's hull below the waterline. Otago lost all electrical power immediately, her engineering spaces flooded, and she began to sink rapidly. Admiral Kurita and his staff abandoned ship, swimming in oil-covered water as destroyers maneuvered to rescue them. Otago sank at 09:55 hours, just 28 minutes after the torpedo hits, taking 360 of her crew of 800 with her. Data immediately shifted targets, firing 4 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Takao. All 4 hit, the explosions breaking Takao's back and flooding multiple compartments. Takao didn't sink. Immediately, her crew managing to isolate flooded sections and keep her afloat, but she was crippled so severely that she had to withdraw from the battle escorted by 2 destroyers. She would spend the remainder of the war under repair at Singapore, never returning to service. Dace, firing from the opposite side of the Japanese column, targeted the heavy cruiser Maya, launching 4 torpedoes at 09:56 hours. Multiple torpedoes hit, the explosions breaking Maya's keel and detonating her magazines. Maya broke in half and sank in 8 minutes, taking 769 of her crew of 1,000 with her. In a single coordinated attack lasting less than 30 minutes, 2 American submarines had sunk 2 fleet cruisers, crippled a third, and left the commander of the center force without a flagship, staff, command center, or effective communications at the opening of the largest naval battle in history. Admiral Kurita transferred his flag to the battleship, Yamato, but he had lost his communications equipment, his charts, his operations staff, and hours of critical time during the transfer. His subsequent performance at Leyte Gulf, characterized by hesitation, confusion, and ultimately withdrawal, despite having American landing forces at his mercy, may have been partially attributable to the submarine attack that disrupted his command structure at the critical moment. The broader strategic impact of Leyte Gulf was that the Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Japan lost 1 fleet carrier, 3 light carriers, 3 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The ships that escaped were trapped in home waters by fuel shortages, caused by submarines sinking tankers faster than Japan could replace them. The super battleship Yamato had fuel for only a one-way voyage when she sortied in April 1945 for a suicide attack on American forces at Okinawa. She was sunk by carrier aircraft without ever reaching her target, going down with 2,498 of her crew of 3,332. The decisive fleet battle for which Japanese naval doctrine had prepared for 40 years had been fought and lost, not through inferior tactics or insufficient courage, but because the logistics system that kept the fleet operating had been destroyed by American submarines that Japanese intelligence had underestimated catastrophically. Commander Howard Gilmore's final patrol aboard USS Growler in February 1943 illustrated both the aggressive tactics that characterized American submarine operations and the human cost of the campaign. On the night of February 7th, operating on the surface off Rabaul, Growler encountered a Japanese gunboat. Gilmore attempted to dive, but the gunboat turned directly toward Growler, forcing a collision. The impact threw Gilmore and several lookouts from the bridge. Japanese machine gun fire raked Growler's conning tower. Gilmore, severely wounded, realized that diving immediately offered the only chance to save his submarine and crew. His last order, called down through the conning tower hatch, "Take her down." The officer of the deck, knowing his captain was still topside, hesitated. Gilmore repeated, "Take her down." Growler dove, leaving Gilmore and 2 lookouts in the water. All 3 men were lost. Gilmore received the Medal of Honor posthumously, one of 52 submarines lost during the war, taking 3,500 officers and men with them. American submarine losses, while significant in absolute terms, represented sustainable attrition given the production rates American shipyards achieved. 52 submarines lost over 4 years from a force that grew to over 300 boats meant that American submarine strength increased every month, despite combat losses. Japanese merchant losses, by contrast, represented existential threat. By January 1945, Japan's merchant marine had been reduced to less than 25% of its December 1941 strength. The ships that survived did so by hiding in ports, not daring to venture into waters patrolled by American submarines that controlled the seas as completely as any naval force in history. The statistics documented the transformation from 1942's failures to 1944's dominance. In 1942, American submarines fired 1,442 torpedoes and sank 109 ships for 418,000 tons. In 1943, submarines fired 3,937 torpedoes and sank 284 ships for 1,349,000 tons. In 1944, submarines fired 6,902 torpedoes and sank 492 ships for 2,388,000 tons. The effectiveness improvement was roughly tenfold once the torpedoes began functioning properly and submarine numbers increased to overwhelm Japanese defenses. By the end of the war, American submarines had sunk 1,178 Japanese merchant vessels, totaling 5,303,000 tons, representing 54.6% of all Japanese shipping losses from all causes. More critically, they had sunk 201 naval vessels, including the aircraft carrier Shinano, the largest carrier ever built, at 72,000 tons, displacement, and the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. USS Archerfish, commanded by Commander Joseph Enright, intercepted Shinano on her maiden voyage on November 28, 1944. Shinano had been converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull into an armoured support carrier, designed to operate as a floating base for other carriers. She was virtually unsinkable by conventional estimates, with armour, protection exceeding any previous carrier, and damage control systems that should have enabled her to survive multiple torpedo hits. Enright fired 6 torpedoes from a range of 1,400 yards. 4 hit, the explosions causing what appeared to be manageable damage. Shinano's captain, confident in his ship's survivability, continued toward port rather than conducting immediate damage control. Over the following hours, poor damage control procedures allowed flooding to spread through improperly sealed compartments. 7 hours after the torpedo hits, Shinano capsized and sank, taking 1,500 sailors with her. The loss demonstrated that even Japan's most advanced warships, designed with elaborate protection against submarine attack, remained vulnerable to American submarines that could position themselves precisely based on intelligence and deliver weapons that functioned reliably. Shinano's sinking on her maiden voyage, before she ever entered combat service, represented not just the loss of a valuable asset but psychological blow to Japanese morale that suggested no ship was safe from submarine attack. The submarine campaign's economic impact exceeded even the direct shipping losses. By January 1945, Japan's war economy had effectively collapsed for lack of raw materials that could no longer be transported safely. Oil refineries operated at under 10% of capacity for lack of crude. Steel production had fallen to less than 30% of 1944 levels. Aircraft production had declined by over 60%. Naval construction had virtually ceased as shipyards lacked steel plate, electrical components, and machinery. Training programs for pilots, sailors, and soldiers consumed fuel that didn't exist. Japanese cities faced genuine famine conditions by spring 1945. Rice rations in Tokyo fell to less than 1,200 calories per person per day, below subsistence levels. Black markets flourished as desperate civilians paid exorbitant prices for food smuggled from rural areas. The government implemented increasingly draconian measures to maintain control, but the simple reality was that Japan couldn't feed its population without imports, and submarines had cut those imports to unsustainable levels. American strategic bombing, which received enormous attention in popular accounts and post-war assessments, was actually secondary to the submarine blockade in destroying Japan's ability to wage war. The Army Air Force's firebombing campaign against Japanese cities, while devastating to civilian populations and psychologically traumatic, had limited immediate impact on Japan's war economy because that economy had already been crippled by lack of raw materials. Factories couldn't operate without steel, aluminum, coal, and oil, regardless of whether they were being bombed. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6 and 9, 1945, provided the Japanese government with a face-saving reason to surrender. But Japan was already defeated economically and militarily by that point. The nation simply couldn't continue fighting regardless of battlefield outcomes, because the economic foundation of its war effort had been destroyed by submarines. The final irony involves the gross underestimation that shaped Japanese strategic planning. The assumption that American submarine strength would remain around 30 boats, perhaps growing to 50 or 60, was embedded in every logistical calculation, every convoy protection plan, every resource allocation decision made by Japanese naval planners before and during the war. When actual American submarine strength exceeded 240 Gato-class boats alone, Japanese anti-submarine forces faced impossible mathematics that no amount of tactical skill or operational courage could overcome. Japanese naval officers after the war acknowledged this fundamental intelligence failure in remarkably candid terms. Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, Navy Minister and later Prime Minister, told interrogators that Japanese planning assumptions about American submarine production capabilities were catastrophically wrong, that Japanese intelligence had underestimated American industrial capacity by factors that made pre-war strategic calculations meaningless. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, Chief of Staff of Combined Fleet, stated that the submarine campaign was the single most decisive factor in Japan's defeat, more significant than carrier operations, more devastating than strategic bombing, more complete in its effects than any other aspect of the American war effort. The mathematics were brutally simple. American shipyards produced 317 fleet submarines during the war. Japanese anti-submarine forces sank 52 of them, roughly 16%. American submarines sank 1,178 Japanese merchant ships, over 50% of Japan's entire merchant marine. The exchange ratio was unsustainable for Japan from the moment the first Gato-class boats began arriving in the Pacific in numbers that exceeded Japanese intelligence estimates. Lieutenant Mochitsura Hashimoto, the same officer who watched Japanese submarines depart for Pearl Harbor in December 1941, survived the war after his submarine, I-58, sank the cruiser USS Indianapolis on July 30, 1945. In testimony after the war, Hashimoto acknowledged that Japanese submarine doctrine had emphasized attacking enemy warships while American submarines focused on merchant shipping, and that this doctrinal difference proved decisive. Japanese submarines sank relatively few American merchant ships because American merchant convoys were heavily escorted and because Japanese submarines prioritized naval targets. American submarines sank over half of Japan's merchant marine because they prioritized economic warfare over purely military targets. The lesson Japanese planners learned too late was that island nations dependent on seaborne logistics cannot survive determined submarine campaigns that target economic infrastructure. The weapon Japanese intelligence had dismissed in 1941 as modest threat had strangled the Japanese Empire by 1945, sinking more tonnage than all other American forces combined, destroying the maritime logistics system that an island nation required for survival, and demonstrating that wars are won not just by tactical brilliance or operational excellence, but by the grinding economic realities of industrial capacity, resource availability, and the ability to produce weapons in quantities that overwhelm enemy defenses. The Gato-class submarine, designed for mass production by shipyards with minimal submarine experience, built at rates Japanese intelligence thought impossible, armed with torpedoes that finally worked after 2 years of failures, guided by intelligence that revealed convoy routes. Japanese thought secure, manned by increasingly aggressive commanders who learned from early mistakes, represented industrial warfare at its most ruthless and effective. The campaign demonstrated that numerical superiority, logistical capacity, and engineering capability could overcome initial technical failures to produce victory through sheer, relentless pressure that the enemy could not match or counter. Japanese naval power didn't sink in glorious battle. It sank in the cold mathematics of tonnage lost versus tonnage built, a calculation where American industrial might and Japanese intelligence failures combined to produce inevitable defeat. The submarines that Japanese intelligence assessed as manageable threat in December 1941 became the force that strangled the Japanese Empire, proving that in warfare, underestimating enemy production capabilities is a mistake that nations make at their mortal peril. The American submarine campaign represented the fulfillment of strategic theory that maritime nations are vulnerable to commerce raiding, carried out with industrial capacity that rendered pre-war assumptions obsolete. 240 Gato-class submarines, built by yards that didn't exist in peacetime, crewed by men who learned their trade under combat conditions, sank an empire. The mathematics were written not in spectacular carrier battles that captured headlines, but in the grinding attrition of cargo ships that never reached port, tankers that burned at sea, transports that took soldiers and supplies to the ocean floor, and the systematic destruction of the logistics network that sustained Japan's ability to wage war. Japanese intelligence expected 30 submarines. American shipyards built 240 Gatos. That single intelligence failure, compounded by assumptions about American industrial capacity that proved catastrophically wrong, cost Japan the war in the Pacific as certainly as any battle fought by armies or fleets. The weapon that sank the Japanese Empire wasn't the atomic bomb or the B-29 or the fast carrier task force. It was the Gato-class submarine, built faster than anyone thought possible, employed more aggressively than anyone predicted, and decisive beyond anyone's expectations when the war began. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.